Hello everyone and good afternoon and welcome to Just Political Reality. On today's show we'll look at the fallout from the local election results on Thursday, momentous night in Northern Ireland, bad night for the Tories in England, even worse night for them in Scotland and Wales, and what of the other political parties? What might this mean for the future general election whenever that comes, and the Tory majority, which appears to be ebbing away. We'll also today have a look at Roe v Wade and the draft Supreme Court ruling, which, if made whole at the end of June, as it would appear it is likely to be, will cause a constitutional tsunami in the United States. Finally, we'll have a look at the cost of energy crisis and exactly what levers the government could, and in my opinion should, pull to help those who are having to choose between heating and eating. Not too bad in May, but really bad in October and November. Let's get into it. So the local elections have been and gone. For the Conservative Party, it's fair to say it was not a great night. 342 seats lost in England, 63 in Scotland and 86 in Wales. So 491 seats altogether as at the time of this recording, which is around 5 p.m. on Sunday the 8th of May. Their vote share in England is down to 30% and they control no councils in either Scotland or Wales. For the Liberal Democrats, some modest gains in the Blue Wall, and in fact they were the most successful party at picking up councillors across the country, including a landmark victory for them in Hull against the Labour Party. For Labour itself, London remains a fortress, and that will not change without a political earthquake, but there was not much else for them to celebrate. Let's have a look at some of the factors that may have affected Tory support. Well, there are the obvious things. The national insurance increase, freezing of personal allowances, the 54% increase in the energy cap that kicked in from the 1st of April. A further 40% is planned for the 1st of October, and that's assuming relatively benign wholesale energy prices over the next 5 to 6 months. The green levy on electricity remains. It must be scrapped. VAT on energy bills remains a key Brexit commitment to remove that. A 6% increase from 19% to 25% in corporation tax will kick in from the 1st of April 2023. That is a jobs tax and will hardly incentivise companies to go out and employ more people. Inflation is heading for 10%. And that's not my words, it's the Bank of England's. It's now expected to remain above 7% in 2023. The ridiculous adherence to net zero, when China are building 100 new coal-fired power stations a year, really has to be looked at. It is increasingly absurd. Stagflation, where the economy grows less quickly than inflation, is now baked into the economy until at least 2024. Interest rates are now at 1%. They began the year at 0.1%, so that's a 900% increase on the year to date. The Bank of England is forecasting they will reach 2% in 2023. Now the impact of that for those on variable rates is likely to be possibly arrears, worst case, repossessions. Now some would welcome the prospect of a fall in house prices. They're still roaring at the moment at around 10% annually, but I do expect them to begin to fall back over the next 18 months as the bubble begins to burst. And the rise in interest rates will definitely burst that bubble. Wage growth is lagging way behind inflation. Wage growth is around 3.8%, and even on the government's most, shall we say, optimistic metric, that's at 7. As that widens, the pinch will feel much more painful. Immigration, both legal and illegal, is far too high. The Rwanda policy may or may not deal with the Channel crossings issue, but that barely scratches the surface. Legal immigration looks set to increase hugely in the coming years, not least as a result of Boris's recent trip to India. So let's look at Labour. Well, they've pretty much gone nowhere. Apart from taking the new Cumberland authority that was previously Carlisle, they only won one other council outside of London. Yes, they've made a dent in the Tories' flagship London boroughs of Westminster, Wandsworth and Barnet. But really, London was already Labour's. It's going to remain Labour's indefinitely. With a minority of white British people in London, a hugely diverse population, it is no surprise to me that the Tories lost those seats, particularly Wandsworth, where all 4 MPs in the catchment area are all now Labour. The Labour Party are now second, ahead of the Tories, behind the Scottish Nationalists in Scotland, but a very distant second. They barely have half as many councillors as the Scottish Nationalists. What all this adds up to is pretty much no significant progress at the next general election. They may gain 50 or 60 seats from a low watermark under Corbyn, but it's certainly nowhere near enough to turn the tide into a Labour majority. The return of Beergate is significant for Keir Starmer. As a former Director of Public Prosecutions and the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, given the vitriol he has levelled at Boris Johnson at PMQs week after week in relation to Partygate, it is going to look rather hollow if he himself is issued with a fixed penalty notice and fails to resign. As for Angela Rayner, let's see. Starmer looks increasingly like a rank hypocrite. Beergate is not going away anytime soon. As for the Labour Party, they still don't know what a woman is. And so the Liberal Democrats, yes, they have dented the Tories in the south, but I think it's fair to say that Joe Swinson's ready for government prediction can remain just that, a prediction, for a very long time to come, at least 20 or 30 years. They may end up in a power sharing arrangement, but they won't be governing anything anytime soon. So what of the Scottish Nationalists? Well, they've gained some more councillors. In other news, the sun rose and fell. They will no doubt push for Indy Ref 2 and say they have a legitimate claim on it, and Boris will say no. So then to Northern Ireland. Now the turnout here was significantly higher than the rest of Great Britain, where 35% was about the average. Northern Ireland and its own ecosystem, very significant elections at Stormont, 62.8% turnout. Now the Northern Ireland Protocol really gifted Sinn Féin the leading number of votes. They got 27 councillors compared to, 27 MLAs compared to 25 for the Democratic Unionists, whose vote share fell by 7% compared to the previous election. The DUP are also not willing to work in a power sharing arrangement until the British government takes care of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now this is very dicey ground. 54 of the newly elected 90 MLAs are quite happy with the protocol as is or with minor amendments. 36 are not. All unionist, of course. The government is treading on eggshells. The takeaways then from the local elections are as follows. With the exception of Sinn Féin, who of course are the first Republican Party to have a First Minister when it eventually sits at Stormont, you have to say that's a great result for them. The Scottish Nationalists will argue, well, they've increased their number of councillors, they've increased their legitimacy, they should have their independence referendum. I disagree. For Labour, they're in treacle. For the Liberal Democrats, they will say it's the second coming, the third coming, the fifth coming. It's not. They will struggle to get 20 seats at the next general election. And for the Tories, this really must be the final wake-up call before the final countdown. With average turnout significantly under 40%, the truth is none of the above was the only real winner in these elections in Great Britain. My best guess is we are heading for a hung parliament at the next general election. I expect the Tories to lose around 60 seats, and no one will work with them if they cannot command a majority. The way in which they treated the Democratic Unionist Party, who was their confidence and supply partner under Theresa May, is little short of shoddy. Labour is now the party of metropolitan areas only. They will end up very short of an overall majority. I expect them to pick up 50, possibly 60 seats, but that is way short of the number needed to give them an overall majority at Westminster. The Liberal Democrats, as I said earlier on, I think will creep up to around 20 seats. They will do some damage to the Tories. They may even take the scalp of Dominic Raab. But the real kingmakers are likely to be the Scottish Nationalists. And in exchange for a keep the Tories out coalition, they will look to extract huge concessions, not least around ditching some of their national debt back onto the UK balance sheet, in advance of an independence referendum that, if they win, they will wish to leave the United Kingdom and join the European Union. They are way out on the convergence criteria, but that's not going to stop Nicola Sturgeon. Now, all of this assumes that Boris Johnson remains Prime Minister and that policy continues broadly as is, unconservative and ununionist, net zero obsessed, presiding over the acceleration of the breakup of the United Kingdom. There is another way. By reversing the national insurance increase, cutting income tax, leaving corporation tax well alone, in fact reducing it to 15% to bring us in line with Ireland, scrapping the green levy on electricity bills, scrapping VAT on domestic energy bills, a key Brexit commitment not honoured, and junking the ridiculous net zero nonsense. When people are having to choose between heating and eating, they definitely cannot afford electric cars. It is time for the return of conservatism, for the return of unionism. The heating or eating choice is more like simply surviving indefinitely. And when I said there's another way, does anyone have a mobile phone number for Lord David Frost? One of the principles of this show is that whilst current affairs are important in the moment, and they will be covered, I'm determined to spend time on things that pass the will it matter test on 3 timelines: 6 months, 6 years and 60 years. The draft US Supreme Court ruling that overturns Roe v. Wade and returns abortion law to state level is one such subject. If this takes place, it will be a constitutional tsunami. It is extremely rare for the US Supreme Court to overturn previous constitutional law. Prohibition and segregation would be examples. It is likely that 20 states, heavily Republican oriented, would outlaw abortion. The civil unrest that comes if the final ruling in June is passed when the court rises is likely to be significant. Think Black Lives Matter and then think again. Stronger, in my opinion. Now, what all of this does, in my opinion, is give the Democrats a chance in the November midterm elections. I'm not saying that Roe v. Wade was good legislation. Part of the issue with it is it was made around the issue of privacy. But current polling points to the Republicans taking both the House of Representatives and the Senate. That said, the judiciary sits outside of the political system. I will be covering this story in detail if the final ruling is in line with the draft, because the reverberations from it are so significant it cannot, will not be ignored, not least by feminists. And so finally on today's show, a quick look at the evolving and deepening cost of energy crisis. For those of you that have been following the news, you'll know that the energy price cap, which is in fact the average energy bill for domestic users, has already increased this year from around £1,200 to just under £2,000. Now that hit from the 1st of April. Given the ongoing war in Ukraine, wholesale energy prices have continued to increase. And the best guess at the moment is that energy prices will increase by a further 40% to around £2,800 a year from the 1st of October. Because we're currently in summer, I suspect most people will not be feeling the pinch too much as yet in relation to their utility bills, despite the fact that utility companies have done their level best to increase direct debits by a disproportionate amount, landing them in trouble with the regulator. That can be overcome in the short term, I believe, but what's coming round the corner in October absolutely cannot. The government is sitting on its hands. They had a key Brexit pledge to remove VAT from domestic energy. They have yet to do so. Now 5% of £2,800 is £140 a year. May not sound that much to those affluent, middle class and able to afford rocketing energy bills, but for those who are living on fixed incomes, those who are living on the poverty line, and millions are being drawn into the poverty line by these increases and other increases in taxation levied by this government, it's a heck of a lot of money. And then you look at the green energy levy on electric bills, which under the old system, when energy bills were averaging around £1,200 a year, was around 23% of the electricity proportion. It's less than that now because the proportion is lower, but the amount is still the same, around £250 a year. Now I'm not saying that £180 or £140 even in VAT and £250 in green energy subsidy is going to help that much when you have a bill of £2,800, but in pure pounds, shillings and pence, it's a £390 reduction. So that bill that potentially could go from £2,000 to £2,800 from the 1st of October could be softened by around half by going from £2,000 to around £2,400. It's still a hellish increase. It's still a lot of money to find, and the choice between heating and eating becomes more real. Those who know me well will know that I've called on the government to seriously reconsider its tax and spend policy. I'm in favour of low taxation, and particularly now where the country appears to be heading into recession, it is more important than ever that people keep more of their hard-earned money in their pocket and not in that of Rishi Sunak. I want the government to cut income tax. I want them to get rid of the green energy levy, scrap VAT on domestic fuel, reverse the planned hike in corporation tax from 19% to 25%, and in fact reduce it to 15%. Why am I so in favour of cutting taxes? We are heading for a recession if you believe the Bank of England. Cutting taxation increases the tax take to the exchequer. This is common sense. It will also benefit hard-working people struggling with what's heading for double digits inflation. Their wage growth of around 4% against potential inflation of 10% is nowhere near. So the government must do all it can to help them. But rather than borrowing more and more money or spending more and more money, it needs to go back to Conservative principles and reduce the state size. Stop taking more money out of people's pockets. The hypothecated tax for the NHS and social care arising from the 1.25% increase in national insurance is unnecessary. Absolutely scandalous. The National Health Service already receives over £3 billion a week, and it is the NHS, make no mistake, that will get the lion's share of this increase in national insurance, not the care system. Now, there's an argument to be made for the government putting more money into care, but the National Health Service is grossly inefficient, grossly ineffective, and whilst currently free at the point of need, is a fading force. We are at best a mid-tier ranking health service. Clap for our carers? Not anymore, I'm afraid. It is far more important to me that hard-working people can both eat and heat their homes with dignity and come out the other side of this largely government-led horrendous economic crisis we are now in one piece. Don't let the government fool you. All of this was baked in to a great extent prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is one thing our Prime Minister grandstanding with Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev. It is another completely to ignore the economic crisis exacerbated by illegal and legal immigration in the United Kingdom. As I said in an earlier passage, it is time for conservatism, time for unionism, and time for action. I'm still looking for David Frost's number. Thank you for joining me for this latest edition of Just Political Reality, and don't forget also to watch my special interview with Luke Doherty, the chairman of the Orthodox Conservatives, which is on a separate release. Next week's show will feature Robert Olds, who's the director of the Bruise Group and also of Impact International. We'll also be covering extensively the Beach Home Children's Home scandal in Wandsworth, dating back to the 1950s and 1960s. I'll be interviewing Graham Sargent, who's one of the survivors of that atrocity. I also hope to interview Sammy Woodhouse, who is one of the survivors of the Rotherham child grooming gangs, to get Sammy's view on this matter. And finally, I hope to interview Katie Scarletta in relation to the groundbreaking result in Northern Ireland. That's all for next week, and that's all for today as well. Thank you very much for joining me. Have a good week ahead.